They watched the horizon darken. Ships rose like a moving city where the sea should have been empty. The room held its breath. Captain Hiroshi stood at the window, fingers white around the rail, and did not speak. The admiral went suddenly pale. Lieutenant Saito swallowed until the sound echoed off the map table. "We misjudged their scale," someone said, 5 words that fell like gravel and stopped conversation. It was June of that year. The island appeared small on the chart, but in reality it was a hub of everything at stake: ports, airstrips, storage yards. A battered report lay open on the table, its edges frayed from constant reading. The promise was simple and terrible. We will show how a handful of pages, a short cable, and one man watching from a bridge changed the course of days. The crackle of the radio, the oily smell of engine grease in the corridor, the distant thud of gunfire anchored the moment in the body as much as the mind. Today we follow Captain Hiroshi through the incredible moments he witnessed during the American invasion, and we will see why numbers on a page became decisions with names. Inside the command room, the realization came like a physical thing that could be touched. Maps lay like open wounds, pins and thread marking hopes and lines. Ensign Aiko Mori leaned over a chart and read aloud while the translator Ito repeated in clipped, exact syllables. "They will land north and south simultaneously," Ito said. "They will sustain a daily unloading of men and material far beyond our estimates." The admiral looked up. "How far beyond?" Corporal Tanaka rubbed his temple, feeling the rough fabric of his uniform under his fingers. 5 times our forecasts," Aiko answered, voice thin. "At least 3 divisions a week if they keep pace." The exchanges went on until voices frayed. "We cannot hold both flanks," Saito argued. "We lack the logistics." "We lack the carriers," said Admiral Nakamura. "Our fuel is running out." "Then what do we do?" asked Hiroshi, almost whispering. "Do not retreat," the admiral replied, as if he had not slept for days. "We find a way to buy time." The room smelled of cigarette smoke and sea salt, paper dust and sweat. The radio hissed with coded voices like distant waves. Each line of dialogue scratched at the certainty they had carried into the island the week before. Weeks earlier, a memo had been filed away in a drawer and then forgotten. It resurfaced now like a prophecy being exhumed. Major Yamada had written it months before, a dry intelligence estimate that mentioned production curves and transit times. "If Allied yard output continues, our defensive window closes in 6 months," the memo read. The words were recited slowly, as if tasting bitterness. Sergeant Fujiwara, who had once worked in a dockyard before the war, traced the columns with a grubby finger and muttered numbers back as if to make them lie. "They turn out escort carriers and transports that dwarf ours," he said. "Our factories build engines by the dozens, theirs by the thousands." The paper crackled when Hiroshi folded it, the sound like thin ice breaking underfoot. In the light, the margins made the past live. Notes in a different hand, a penciled correction, the single line, "Reassess assumptions," scrawled in haste. That admonition had been ignored then. Now it lay between them like a verdict. The industrial nightmare became a map of impossibilities. Reports arrived stamped with dates and yard names: Cleveland, Norfolk, Bremerton. The numbers piled up into an avalanche. "They can produce carrier equivalents 3 times faster than we can replace losses," Aiko read, voice steadier now but hollow. "They launch hundreds of aircraft a month. Their convoys can resupply a division every 5 days. Hiroshi touched the paper as if feeling another man's pulse. He could taste metal in his mouth when someone spoke of tonnage. The contrast was brutal. Logistics ceased to be abstract. Visuals multiplied in the room. Photographs of American bridges, of ships, black smoke like columns, cranes moving like giant arthropods. The smell of diesel and fresh timber from captured docks drifted through memory and into the present. Analytically, the numbers were clear and implacable. Emotionally, they were a hand closing across the throat. "We face a machine," Nakamura said. "A machine that will grind any static defense if we let it." The room counted losses in percentages, in replacement rates, in the time it would take to build a single carrier-class vessel versus the months it would take them. The comparison was a scalpel. Then the leader asked the question that forced the room to choose what to value: honor or survival. The governor of the island, a civilian authority named Hayato, entered the room with dusty shoes and asked plainly, "If they can land forever, what do we preserve?" Hiroshi remembered the way Hayato's voice trembled, a fine sound against the scrape of chairs. Saito replied with a recitation of doctrine about holding ground. "We maintain lines until given the order to withdraw," he said. "The code demands it." "But at what cost?" Hiroshi asked. "Will the island be a badge or a cemetery?" Corporal Tanaka looked at the map and felt the paper under his fingertips become thin as hope. "We preserve honor," said Nakamura, jaw clenched. "We save face." "Or we preserve lives," Aiko countered, hands folded, nails white where she gripped her own skin. The air tasted like old coffee and the bitter resin of stress. The question hung heavy, and no paper could answer it. A short message arrived that afternoon, small, almost trivial in its length, but seismic in effect. Ito read it aloud without emphasis. "Evacuate key personnel to mainland. Hold public posture." The room reacted. "Evacuate key personnel to mainland. Hold public posture." The words looped in their heads. Hiroshi felt the floor tilt. "Who sent it?" Saito demanded. "High Command," said Nakamura,
folding his hands as if to shield them. "Coded, authorized." "Do they expect us to abandon civilians?" Hayato asked. The admiral closed his eyes. "They expect us to save what remains of leadership," he said. "They expect us to keep the narrative intact." The dialogue continued until positions hardened. "If we send ships, they become targets," Fujiwara said. "If we do not send ships, the command survives on paper only." "Send small boats at night," Major Yamada proposed. "Rotate volunteers, leave behind cadres." "That is desertion dressed as strategy," Saito spat. "No, it is survival," Aiko answered softly. The message was short, but it pivoted the conversation from theoretical to immediate. The room smelled of rain and wet rope. Fingers left salt prints on wood. Radios buzzed like insects. Each sentence threw light on the costs hidden behind words. A secret meeting followed in a smaller cabin, where options that could never be spoken of publicly were laid on the table. Here the dialogue grew sharp, full, and bruising. "We can attempt an organized withdrawal," Nakamura said. "We can stage rearguard actions to slow them. We can fight to the last man and let our islands be tombs that make legends," Saito said. "We can negotiate terms and risk losing honor," Hayato whispered. "We can sabotage the docks and deny them advantage," Fujiwara suggested, hands trembling. Hiroshi listened and then spoke. "If we deny them the harbor, we also deny our people escape," he said. "I refuse to ask mothers to choose between a lifeboat and a flag." "What is the cost of that refusal?" Aiko demanded. "Thousands," Hiroshi answered. "And who counts thousands?" "We do," said Nakamura. The exchanges kept coming until the idea of options themselves felt exhausted. The cabin was thick with the smell of sweat and wet wool, the taste of iron on tongues, the creak of hinges. Their words were the only currency left, and they spent it fast. In that small room, Captain Hiroshi watched men he had known for years reveal fractures he had not expected. He named them in his mind to hold them steady. Admiral Nakamura, Lieutenant Saito, Ensign Aiko Mori, Corporal Tanaka, Sergeant Fujiwara, Major Yamada, Translator Ito. Each name became a weight. At roughly 1/3 of this story, we pause and ask you to reflect. If the numbers on those pages chilled you as they chilled them, tell us below. If you were in the room and had to choose between a symbolic stand and a plan that would save lives, how would you start your answer? Begin your comment with "I would have," and then say the first action you would order. Your perspective matters, because history reads like a debate, and every view sharpens understanding. Sharing your choice helps others see different moral calculations and may shape future videos where we compare decisions across theaters. If you felt a chill at the memo that said their production outpaced yours by 5-1, say so. If
you think Captain Hiroshi should have disobeyed orders, explain why. We will read your comments, and the most thoughtful answers may be featured in a follow-up episode. Now we return to the room where a decision was coming into focus. The realization finally came with the pounding of shells and the sight of smoke over the northern beaches. Cities burned like slow suns. The invasion unfolded in numbers and in faces. Reports from reconnaissance showed landing craft in formations that looked endless, the sea dotted with supply vessels. Hiroshi watched from his ship as columns of vehicles rolled ashore, as airfields filled with new squadrons, as captured docks became forward bases within days. Each detail added to dread: the ringing of distant explosions like metallic bells, the acrid smell of burning fuel, the grit of ash on lips, the sting of salt water sprayed by waves disturbed by the traffic of war. Casualty counts rose, and replacements did not come. The plan of invasion that the defenders had feared now operated with grim efficiency. "Bombardments have softened our positions," Saito reported. "Reinforcements are delayed by storms." "Their supply lines are short and fast," Nakamura said. "Our ammunition dwindles more quickly than anyone predicted." The human cost was immediate. Families fled with what they could carry, faces streaked with soot and tears. Soldiers who had joked 2 nights before fell silent, as if silence itself could preserve them. The contrast between industrial output and human endurance could not be more cruel. The enemy did not fight with a single hand, but with whole factories and railheads moving in concert. Hiroshi described the explosions to himself like a ledger, each blast a debit against hope. The decision came at dusk in a council that smelled of vinegar and old uniforms. The admiral spoke first, and then fell silent, waiting for someone to say the thing everyone knew but no one wanted to say. "We must prioritize lives over symbols," he said. The room exhaled as if a collective burden had been lifted. Hayato looked relieved and devastated at once. "If we preserve command and some people survive, we can rebuild later," Aiko said. "If we fight to the end, there may be no one left to tell the story." Nakamura rose slowly and placed his palm on the map as if weighing a nation. "We will authorize a limited withdrawal under cover of night," he declared. "We will evacuate key personnel and families. We will deny facilities to the enemy wherever possible." Saito stood and did not speak for a long moment. He finally said, "I will lead the rearguard." "We will not abandon civilians," Hiroshi added firmly. "We will evacuate them first." The decision rippled outward like a stone dropped in water. It was not total surrender. It was a painful strategic unmaking of an idea in order to secure a future. The phrase that closed the debate was simple and small, and would be remembered in ways the authors could not foresee reality to save tomorrow. 1 month later, the island was a different place, and so were the men who had made the choice. Evacuations had been chaotic and methodical at once. Small boats under cover of darkness had crossed choppy seas with families cradled like fragile packages. Ensign Aiko Mori organized manifest lists, reading names by lantern light while tearful relatives passed hearing them aloud. Lieutenant Saito led staggered rearguard positions that bought hours at the price of dread. Corporal Tanaka and Sergeant Fujiwara sabotaged docks at dawn, smashing gears and pouring oil in ways that would slow the invader but also haunt the island for years. Admiral Nakamura kept records and sent coded messages to the mainland, every comma and line a lifeline. The numbers the Admiral had feared became colorless columns in cable traffic, but the human stories became sharp. 2,000 civilians reached friendly shores in the first month. Several dozen soldiers fell in delaying actions, each recorded with a small formal note and an informal name tag at shore crossings. Captain Hiroshi kept a journal with ink-stained fingers, writing the names of those he helped aboard and the small kindnesses that had saved lives. In the temporary camps on the mainland, translator Ito bridged families to officials, his evenings full of children's questions and his hands smelling of soup and ash. The island lost territory, but saved memory. 3 months later, the picture had evolved into policy and reconstruction the dates. The mainland received the evacuated leaders and set up provisional administrations. Hayato met with planners in smoke-stained rooms and argued for long-term aid and for restoration of ports in ways that would not simply hand advantage back to the occupier. Major Yamada and Admiral Nakamura drew up logistics plans that emphasized dispersal of production and camouflage of lines of supply. The military adapted tactics learned in the island fighting into training manuals. Cut supply lines, hit hard where it hurts, but do not let pride destroy the living, Aiko insisted in a session with policymakers. The population that had fled began slow returns to salvage what they could, and with them came bitter assessments and frank conversations about what honor truly meant. Rebuilding took the form of small, measurable acts. Bridges were repaired at half the pace of pre-war efforts, but with the added protection of decentralized caches. The Admiral's records showed that while frontline manpower had decreased, the preservation of core leadership allowed for coordination that prevented total collapse. International aid filtered in, and the island became a case study in survival strategy more than martyrdom. Captain Hiroshi lectured once to a small group of officers, and his calm voice carried the memory of nights at sea when choices were razor sharp. The lessons they codified were not abstract. They were lists, evacuation protocols, civilian manifests, sabotage procedures, and post-evacuation governance plans. Those lists would save lives in later campaigns. 6 months later, the consequences were visible across the broader theater. The enemy had consolidated gains, but faced a different kind of resistance in pockets and in the political fallout of occupying dense urban centers. The evacuation of leadership allowed a provisional government to organize an exile and to coordinate relief. Reconstruction funds were allocated, port repair crews trained to work under intermittent shelling. Statistically, the preservation of command had meant that in the following quarter, logistic throughput to Allied forces was reduced by 20% in contested regions where scorched earth tactics had been employed, buying crucial time. Families that had once sat on beaches with only the clothes on their backs began to rebuild homes, to open small markets, to teach children again. The human cost remained severe, but the moral calculus shifted from pure defeat to mediated survival. Captain Hiroshi visited a rebuilt school and watched children draw ships not as weapons but as ferries, a subtle migration of image that meant future generations might choose differently. The names of those who had died were read aloud at small memorials, and the men who had argued in that cabin gathered to mark decisions that had saved far more lives than a hollow stand could have. Strategically, the theater adapted. Politically, the choice to prioritize lives over spectacle allowed for a continuity that preserved hopes of future autonomy. The final tally could be written in numbers and checkboxes, but it was softer and more stubborn as well, lived in returned faces and repaired docks. In the end, the story of what Captain Hiroshi witnessed is not a tale of victory or shame alone, but of the terrible arithmetic that binds strategy to conscience. They saw the horizon darken. They read the memos that no one wanted to open. They debated honor and survival until dawn. They chose a path that saved lives at the price of symbols. If this reconstruction of decisions and documents moved you, subscribe and join the conversation where we turn pages into lessons. Remember this final line. At the moment the horizon darkened, the choice to admit reality saved a future none of them could yet imagine.